Hey folks, welcome. And today I'm going to talk to you about the top web frameworks that are available in the market. And I'm also going to dwell into what kinds of frameworks are there, because I think that there is a lot of confusion between one framework versus another framework. And a lot of people think that, there is one framework can do everything, and there is a lot of unnecessary comparison between X framework versus Y framework without really understanding if those are really apples to apples comparison. So here I want to do a quick comparison, and I want to also give you an overview of which frameworks are used in which which part of the web world. So without further ado, let me start off with a full stack framework. And what does a full stack framework mean? A full stack framework means that the framework has inputs to both client side and the server side. So this is a good example. Meteor JS is a good example of a full stack framework, because this framework is omnipresent across the application. So this framework runs in the client. This framework also runs your database. This framework also runs the server. So the entire framework sits on top of the various elements, which is your client, server, and database, which is the classic MVC model, and it runs those elements in a manner where it scaffolds the overall web world for you. So I'm just showing you an example of that. Here you can see that this is Meteor, and it runs on the client side, and it is on the server side, and it's also on the database side. So this is what you call is a full stack framework, and a full stack framework, and we'll get into other types of framework, but just staying on with Meteor. I'll give you a couple of more inputs into it. So Meteor is also known as a real-time framework. So what is a real-time framework? A real-time framework is a framework where whatever changes you push into the code in the server side or the client side immediately gets reflected onto the browser. So that's a real-time framework. In most of the other cases, the push has to be done through a notification process, and there is a bit of a lag between server update versus client update. So sometimes you update things in the client side and it gets reflected, but if you update it on the server side, the server has to refresh and then only gets updated. But as far as Meteor is concerned, it's called a real-time framework. And moving on from Meteor, I will also touch upon a few other frameworks for your benefit and understanding. So very common framework. So Meteor is the only full stack framework available in the web. I repeat it, Meteor is the only full stack framework available in the web today. But there are front-end frameworks and there are back-end frameworks, because developers prefer to use their own databases and their own client-side rendering engines and so on and so forth. So, they like a bit of flexibility, and, not everybody prefers a full stack framework. So, one of the, so we can now explore a few front-end frameworks and a few back-end frameworks. So what are the few front-end frameworks available in the market? One of the famous front-end framework is called Vue.js, and Vue.js is only responsible for the Vue part, and it is a front-end framework. So it basically ensures that all your rendering happens in the way you want it to happen, and it is a very progressive and a very easy and a very lightweight framework. It is a framework written by one individual. It is not a framework which is supported by a huge company. But it's been extremely popular because of its versatility, its approachability, and the way it sort of takes in the good parts of all the other frameworks and puts them together into a very light framework. Another famous framework is called Angular framework. And Angular is a front-end framework, and this is similar to Vue.js. It is front-end, but Angular is a very big framework. It is supported by a company called Google, and it is a very big framework. It has got a lot of elements into it, and it sort of behaves like a full stack framework, but it is not really a full stack framework. So if you're building a large project, then Angular is a good choice for it. If you're building a small project, then maybe Vue.js is a good option. Another good framework that you should be aware of is called as React.js. So React.js is supported by Facebook, and it is similar to AngularJS. It is huge, it is big, and it primarily is a framework which was created for the purpose of manipulating the DOM, and it uses a concept of virtual DOM manipulation so that your DOM is not touched in the process. And a company like Facebook, which has got millions and millions of DOM activities going on in a particular second or in a particular time frame, needed to have something which was very quick in terms of manipulation. So they created something called as React to develop their DOM, to maintain their DOM. It's a very famous framework, but again, it's a front-end framework. I repeat, it's a front-end framework like Angular, like Vue.js. Now, there are few other frameworks which are equally worth mentioning, but they are again not very famous. Keystone Js is another framework that I'd like you to be aware of. It is it's sort of sitting over and above the front end, so it's almost sitting closer to the Vue side of it, and it operates less on the rendering side of it. So it sits really on top of everything else. So Keystone is a good one to know about. So Keystone, Angular, React, and Vue, these are front-end frameworks. And Meteor.js is a full stack framework. And let's look at a couple of very famous back-end frameworks. So Django is a back-end framework. So when I go back and explain to you Meteor, assuming that this is your server and this is your database, the back-end server is one which sits in this side of the town, and the front-end server is one which sits this on the town. So you could have a front-end framework and a different back-end framework, and you could connect both of them through APIs. So a good example of a back-end framework which uses a language called Python is Django. It's a very famous back-end framework, and it is quite good for rapid deployment and application uptime. So if you could see, it says that it's ridiculously fast, it's very secure, and it's extremely scalable. So those are the advantage of Django. It's a very famous framework. Another one which is quite famous is called Rails. Rails is a framework which is extensively used for the development of the web world, and a lot of large companies use it. It is again a back-end framework, and it is famous because it uses a concept of gems, and you can pretty much create a website with most of the gems. And what gems does it is that it is kind of a plugin. So you have a Ruby on Rails community where people create these small plugins, and if you need to sort of use those plugins, you can go and download them and you can install in their site. So you don't have to create something yourself. Now let me give you an example of what a gem could be. A gem could be, for example, your login page. And let's say you want to log into a page and you're clicking on the the login button, and it will go and ask you, do you want to log in through Facebook or Google, or do you want to use your login ID? Now that whole thing can be put together in a small package, and that is called a gem in this case. But that the entire concept is also called as package. Now that's become very famous these days. Meteor JS also has the equivalent of gems, which in its case is called, it uses a search engine called Atmosphere to run it, and most of the new web technology related organizations use gems or packages to install various functionalities. Another very famous backend framework language is called Node.js. Node.js is a language, but it is also a runtime, meaning that you can, it's not necessarily a full stack language like Python, and there is a very famous framework for them. For Node.js, it's called Express.js. So if you want to use Express.js, it uses Node as a platform and runs your application. This is Express.js. So again, this is only related to backend, and React and Angular and Vue are only related to front end. And if you need a full stack framework, then Meteor is a good choice. So let me repeat one more time. Meteor.js, full stack, front end, back end, both. If you want to be customizable, then use Vue.js or React.js or Angular.js. If you want to use a customized backend framework, use Node.js or Ruby on Rails or Django. All these are very famous front end and backend framework. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that people try to compare Django with React. Now that's an absolutely rubbish comparison, because you cannot compare apples to oranges. And sometimes I've seen people comparing, let's say, a Keystone framework to a Meteor framework. Now that's unfair, and that's not even possible. So somebody who's asking this question doesn't understand what he wants to know, really. So the question really here is that if you're comparing a framework, compare the right framework. So you should compare Angular versus React versus Vue. So these are good comparisons. Or you could compare Express versus Ruby on Rails versus the Django. Django. And so likewise, if you want to understand what is a full stack framework, Meteor is a good example of a full stack framework. So I sort of wanted to give you a view of various frameworks. Personally, I like Meteor.js because I believe that I am more interested in development and deployment. And what Meteor.js does for me is that it does everything that I am required to do as a developer. So I just have to pretty much write few lines of code and my application is up and running. That's like a great thing for me. I don't have to worry about a lot of other stuff that developers need to worry about, and especially if I'm building an application for myself or a very small team, then I don't need to really think about developing it using a large framework. So that way Meteor is good. I also like the fact that Meteor is real time. It's pretty much reactive in that sense. It's very good. So full stack, I love the fact that it is a full stack framework. I like the fact that it is a reactive framework, also known as a real-time framework, and also is the fact that Meteor.js uses only one language. So if you learn JavaScript, you will understand how to deploy Meteor. But if you want to deploy let's say Django or Ruby, then you need to learn Rails runs on Ruby and Django runs on Python. So if you want to deploy these particular frameworks, you need to have some knowledge of those languages. I'm not saying you need to have complete knowledge, but again you need to have some knowledge. Whereas in case of Meteor, you don't need to have any knowledge of any other framework, any other language except JavaScript, and it's a very good framework. And also, I like the fact that with a single Meteor framework, you can create both Meteor apps for the web world and for the mobile world, because it also connects you to front-end app frameworks like Cordova, and you can either customize it, or you can, if you don't want to customize it, you can use their own internal front-end framework. Like Meteor uses a front-end framework called Blaze and uses a back-end database called MongoDB. So you can use MongoDB and you can use Blaze. You're fine with that, but you don't want to use Blaze. You want to use React.js. Go ahead and use React.js. You want to deploy it using Vue.js. Go ahead and do Vue.js. You want to use AngularJS. You can use any front-end framework you want to with Meteor. So I think that's a great thing. So that's really good. There is a sort of a limitation in the fact that the database that you would use with Meteor right now is only MongoDB. They are trying to develop to bring in other simpler versions of database like an SQL Server or MySQL, which are very simple databases, and for simple tasks you don't need MongoDB. MongoDB is a NoSQL database, and you require that only for large complex tasks. So maybe that's not the best choice, but nevertheless Meteor doesn't have that right now, so that's kind of a limitation. And with everything there is a limitation, but the fundamental question you need to be asking is what you want to do. Do you want to deploy and develop an app, or do you want to use the best technology so that the app is super fast and super reactive and nobody is actually using the app? So you might have another Facebook kind of an app, but nobody is even aware of it, nobody is using it, versus you might use a very basic app, but everybody loves that particular app because it does something useful. So that's the question that you really need to answer, and I hope you liked this particular session. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. I'm very open to asking questions. If you have any, please do not hesitate to ask me those questions. Have a great day and goodbye.